so much, Effie, for that kind introduction. So I'd like to introduce myself again. I'm Nona Pepito. I'm an assistant professor in economics here at ESSEC. And I'm going to talk to you about something that's not exactly new. And I think this is quite dated if you think about it from a certain perspective. And so I think it's high time, given that a number of years, a decade has passed since this term of the Asian century has come out in the press and has been hyped up quite a lot in the news and with journalists. I think it's a good time now to revisit this concept. And by revisiting this concept, I'm going to depart from what we usually understand to be a master class. This is not going to be a master class in the sense that I'm going to pontificate on this concept and you're going to get answers from me or I'm going to tell you what to think about this concept. But I think by revisiting, what I want is to raise questions. And given the light of recent evidence, especially what we had in the previous decade about the performance of emerging countries, I think it's a good time to revisit this and to re-examine whether the Asian century is indeed something that's going to be a reality, or should it be understood in a different, more dynamic or a more fuller sense. So I first encountered the term Asian century in 2004 via this article by Jeffrey Sachs, and I'm sure most of you know who Jeffrey Sachs is. And as a professional in the Philippines, I haven't gotten my PhD yet at that time. I had gotten out of graduate school and I was teaching in a university. And I was quite an impressionable person, and Jeffrey Sachs is a very impressive figure. So for me, this really caught my eye, and this made quite an impression on me. And in 2004, what Jeffrey Sachs was saying was that the U.S. is going to be in decline, and it's not going to happen immediately. What he's saying is that by the middle of this century, Asia is going to rise in status. Okay? And he says that the reason he makes this claim, even though the U.S. was significantly larger compared to China and India at that time, at this time China was what? 1/8 of the U.S. economy, and India was significantly smaller than that. And also when you look at per capita incomes, China per capita incomes and Indian per capita incomes was much, much smaller compared to that of U.S. per capita incomes. And so then it seems like a very big claim. But he was making this claim on the basis of trends. And he said that once that the China and India started to open up to the economy, and for China this was in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping opened up and liberalized, opened up the economy of China. And for India, this was in the summer of 1991, when Manmohan Singh, then the finance minister, started introducing reforms and started to initiate regulation, especially in the license Raj. So since then, what he said was that, okay, if you looked at their performances from 1978 in the late 1970s, what you notice about China is that the GDP has been growing at on average 10% per year. Of course, on some years it's slower than 10%, on some years it's faster than 10%, but on average it's been growing at around 10%. And for India, it's been slightly lower, it's only 6%. But remember, 6% per year, if you can maintain that for 2 decades, 3 decades, means significant changes in the living of standards of people. And so he was basing it on that. And he said, even if we extrapolate this pattern, even though we know that as countries become richer, they are not going to grow as fast as before. So even if we take that into account, what we're going to expect is by 2050, the Chinese economy, China, is going to be 75% larger than the economy of the US. And India is going to be as large as the economy of the US. And that's, for me, as somebody coming from the Philippines that's been staggering along, struggling with growth. And people have been saying since 1960 for the Philippines that the Philippines is going to be the next big emerging nation. And then came the 1980s and the 1990s, where the Philippines stagnated a bit. So this was quite a very seductive notion to me. And to be told that this is going to be your time and you are in the right place. So it was kind of, it was soothing. It was soothing. it meant that things are going to turn around. And this is now the time for this region. And what we can say is that for China and India, especially if we compare that to the performance of the United States at roughly the same period, the United States was only growing at 3.5% during the same period. And so that was quite a very big comparison. So Jeffrey Sachs went on to say that, okay, China and India is going to narrow the income gap with the US. By the middle of this century, he's not really saying that the living standards in China and India are going to be the same as the living standards in the US. But what he did say is that it's going to narrow. Okay? And in terms of size, although the living standards of the average Chinese or the average Indian is still going to be lower than the average American, in terms of size, by sheer size, China and India is going to have a very big impact on the world economy. He did acknowledge that there are going to be threats to this growth, but he did insist that the decline of the US economy is going to be inevitable. And what he pointed out is that this is not just going to be about a story about China and India. This is going to be a story about the region. And what he's saying is that because of increased trade, so on and so forth, the region is going to become, nations in the region are going to become more and more integrated, and that's going to give rise to a geopolitical entity that is very strong, that is really Asian. The US will benefit from cheap consumer goods. The world will benefit because China and India is going to invest more in research and development, and there will be, as a result, more technological advantages. And he ends by saying that the US should not be afraid of this phenomenon, but then the US will have to learn to be become one of the many successful economies rather than the indispensable one. So we are going to go back to all of those concepts, not necessarily all. And now that I've matured a bit, and the Asian century has progressed a bit, I think some of those concepts are not necessarily true. Okay? And then also the concept has to be taken with a grain of salt. Okay? So, so to be fair, in 2004, if you're looking at it from the experts' perspective, those who are claiming that this is going to be the Asian century, there are many trends in Asia that seems to support this claim. And if you look back, you have the phenomenon of the East Asian economic miracle. And this is the post-war phenomenon in certain countries in Asia, not all, and just certain countries in East Asia that sustained economic growth for many decades. And first, this was for Japan. So Japan, beginning in 1960s, decided to de-emphasize military strength and focus more on economic growth. And what happened was that in the 1960s, Japan was averaging growth rates of 10%. In the 1970s, it slowed down, to be expected, 5%. And in the 1980s, it was 4%. And so that meant that for Japan to sustain that kind of growth for an average of 7% for over 30 years, that meant significant changes in the welfare of the average Japanese. And it's not just for Japan. So what appeared was that the countries that followed the model of Japan also started growing very fast. And these 4 countries, of which Singapore is one, okay, it's now known as the Asian dragons, the East Asian dragons. So this is what accounts for this difference, vast difference in the way that that the Singapore River looks in a matter of 45 years. Okay? And what this also meant was that emerging economies do not just come from Asia. They come from all over the world. But what we can see was that the emerging economies, the economies that grew very fast in Asia, have a very special track record. And what we can say was that, for example, for Taiwan and for South Korea, these are the only 2 countries among the countries that grew very fast in the last half century or so that were able to sustain a growth rate of at least 5% for 50 years. Okay? And there were also those who did not perform as well. Okay? For example, the 4 Asian dragons, and you have also Thailand and Malaysia, they were able to grow at a rate of 5% per year for 40 years. Okay? And that's nothing to scoff at. Okay? So the thing to increasing living standards is not just to have very large growth rates. It's to maintain a respectable, consistent growth rate for 40, 50 years. And that is what pulls a country out from being poor to being one of the advanced nations, like what Singapore has achieved. So then for South Korea, what we see is that they sort of have this trajectory. We know what happened here. You have the Asian crisis, right? And what we see, especially with South Korea, is that the growth has more or less been lower, but it's still hovering around 5%. And for a country that's considered advanced, a 5% average growth rate for a decade is really like punching above its weight. So it's a very, very impressive growth rate for its income class. And so there was that growth, and then in 1997, 1998, the region had a crisis, financial and currency crisis. And instead of spelling the end to the miracle, what happened was that the countries that were hit very hard also recovered relatively fast. Okay? Except for Indonesia, who did not really recover until around 2005, 2006. What we see is around 2004, most of those countries that have been hit very hard have managed to rebound very quickly. It's this big recovery that is fed into this story of a miracle. That you have these post-war experience that is very impressive. You have a crisis that hit countries very hard, and these countries, instead of just stagnating, they've managed to recover very quickly. So you have all of these stories about growth, recovery, and now China, as we see, have spectacular growth rates as high as 15%, even for some years. Okay? And you can see this for India as well. Okay? Now, the thing that we all observed in the past decade is that beginning 1998, let's mark that, okay? China has been growing at a rate of 8% and higher, right? So you can see that this is the lowest that it's ever grown. And we can also say it's the same thing, not just for China, but also for Indonesia. If, as a whole, for this group, you take the average growth rates from this period, I call attention to this period, the miracle years of 2003-2007. You see that on average, for emerging economies, not just for these 4 countries, but for all the emerging economies, not just for Asia, but even in other regions, what has happened was that the average growth rates doubled. So from usually the emerging economies would have an average growth rate of 3.6. During the miracle years of 2003-2007, these emerging economies grew at an average of 7.2% for these years. And you can see the similar patterns for Malaysia, for Philippines, for Taiwan, and for Thailand. And that has more and more fed into this idea that the growth of Asia is really inimitable. Okay, you can't help it. It's just going to keep growing and growing. And that has also given people idea that China is going to keep growing at 8% or more, okay, 7% at the very least. Okay? But I call these miracle years because these are really miracle years. And I will claim that there's sufficient evidence to say that this kind of phenomenon perhaps will never happen again. The emerging economy is growing at this rate, 7.6% for a matter of 4 years. I don't think we'll ever see this again. And that's because the idea, I just give you the reasons for these being the miracle years, the idea that these economies grew, and especially the economies in Asia, they grew very fast because the institutions are very strong or they have learned very valuable lessons from the Asian crisis. Well, in part, perhaps that is true, but there is another factor for the boom, for this spectacular, very big boom, that people tend to ignore. And that is, in 2003, 2007, beginning 2003, a lot of hot money was flowing into the region because of low interest rates in the US. Okay? And that is what fed into the boom largely. And I would also want to perhaps suggest that it would be very early at this point in time to think that for emerging economies in the region, the institutions are very, very strong. In fact, when it comes to reform, even for China, which is the fastest growing economy in the region right now, and on which this idea of the Asian century is being hinged, the reform still has some way to go. Okay, so what has happened though is that because of this boom, you now have many lists of emerging economies, right? The first of these lists, BRICS, came out in 2004. Okay? And then came the CVETs, and then you have the next 11, and then you have the MIKT, and now recently the MIKT has become the MINT, Korea being replaced by Nigeria. So Nigeria now is placed to become one of the 10 largest economies by the middle of the century. Okay? Well, middle of the century, that's a long time, so anything can happen in the middle of the century. Okay? But that is what these lists say. And then you have this last list, CIMBI. And these are the people who have coined these acronyms. So you have this appearance of these acronyms in the press. Okay? And of course, the people who coined together, who put together these classifications, who put together these groups, say that, well, this classification is based on certain things. But the danger, though, is that when these acronyms go to the press, people tend to misinterpret them and the basis of this classification. So, for example, the reason these 4 countries are lumped into BRICS is largely because of their size. It's demography that's feeding into this classification. It's not that the growth in these 4 economies is preordained. In fact, what we see right now is that because Brazil and Russia, these economies are so heavily tied to commodities, when the commodity prices go down or when they collapse, then these economies would go into crisis. So these really don't forecast anything. They should be taken with a grain of salt, is what I would suggest. But these very alluring story, this very seductive story of the inimitable rise of Asia is quite formidable, because especially when people give you pictures like these, okay, like the center of gravity, economic center of gravity is shifting to the east. Okay, even when people say they have caveats about these concepts, when people look at these, it's such a seductive notion that people tend to ignore or forget about those caveats. Okay. This is also something from ADB. ADB says that, okay, this came out in 2011, realizing the Asian century. By the middle of the century, Asia is going to have half of the world's global output. And this is more or less like going back to what Asia was way before, centuries past. Okay? And again, people might interpret this to say that the rise of Asia now is preordained. It's like, this is a very long time forecast, right? A forecast of over several centuries. It's like just going back to what it was supposed to be. When in fact, there's no thing as supposed to be. Okay? Nobody says it just because all of the people are in Asia, most of the people are in Asia, doesn't mean that they should have the largest share in incomes, right? Okay? So it's all about how institutions and economies perform. But when you look at, there's a video about Asia 2050 on YouTube, and I'm not going to play that video here, it would be too long, but I'm just going to capture certain images from there. And that's why I want to capture these certain images, because this really drives home the point that it can be, it can trap you into thinking that this is actually going to happen instead of being, just a possibility. So for example, it says, okay, the report does say that this is going to happen by the middle of the century if these countries keep up their growth momentum. Okay? So that's a very big if. But again, the mind can escape from that, and can ignore that and latch on to what reinforces what you like. So it says that by the middle of the century, per capita incomes will increase 6-fold, and 3 billion more Asians will enjoy the living standards of the Europeans. And this is something that I quote from the video. There will be no poor country in the region. Okay? And that was like when I was watching the video, that phrase kept on repeating in my head, you know? Like, imagine that you're seeing this video for the first time. It's like, there will be no poor country in the region. There will be no poor country in the region. There will be no poor country in the region. You know what it means not to be a poor country in the region? It means that your income is going to be, your per capita GDP is going to be at least 4,000 US dollars. Okay? And you say that to someone from the Philippines whose per capita GDP is just 2,500. You say that to somebody from India whose per capita GDP is just 1,400. You say that to somebody from Cambodia whose per capita GDP is only 800. So say there will be no poor country in the region. And to say that that's going to happen, perhaps not in your lifetime, but it is going to happen. Okay? They do say in the video that it's not preordained. Okay? In fact, when you look at the YouTube video, the title is that Asian century is not preordained. Okay? But if you put these things there, it's the draw, the pull is very strong. Okay? So let's go back to what is originally meant by the Asian century. And if you look at what the experts originally meant by this, and if you go to Wikipedia, okay? So they said, what does the Asian century mean? So the Asian century means primarily that it's a political dominance, a political and a cultural dominance. This political and cultural dominance, like for example, the last century was thought of to be the American century, and the century before that was thought to be the UK, the century of the UK. Well, it meant, of course, that the political power rested on economic dominance. Okay? But to claim that it's the Asian century meant first that you're advancing from just economic strength to political strength. And the problem there is that you're saying Asia is the Asian century, not the Chinese century, or not the Chinese Indian century. You're saying Asia. So it means that to claim that there is going to be an Asian century, this is going to be the Asian century, it means that we think of Asia as a very strong geopolitical entity. And that's a problem because economically, the regions, the countries in this region are very diverse. Okay? They are all over the development stages. Like I said, you have on one hand you have Cambodia, and on the other hand you have China, and then you have the Asian dragons who are advanced economies. So the problem is that if you have such a diverse set of economies, then in the jargon of game theory, it's very hard to, if you have a coordination problem, coordination failure is going to be very likely. Because for you to coordinate your actions, you have to have a certain set of same interests. And when you are very different, then your expectations and your priorities are going to be so different as to make this coordination very difficult. Also, there's the question of having a collective security system, which we don't really have. In fact, because of recent actions by China in terms of territorial disputes, then there have been political tensions on that front. Okay? So it doesn't seem to be that China and India are going to be best buddies. Okay? So there appears to be a difference in principles that they still has to be worked out. And also in terms of security alliances, what tends to be happening is that some countries tend to have bilateral agreements with the US instead of agreements with each other. Okay? We don't see something like NATO in Asia. Okay? So suppose we set that aside. Suppose let's redefine what the Asian century means. And instead of the Asian century meaning as political dominance, suppose we just take it to be economic dominance. Okay? So let's take that apart. So let's see. So this will mean that Asia will have a very large share of global GDP. Okay? And Asia will have higher growth rates compared to the rest of the world. And the economic prominence is based on an increasingly stronger China and a rising India that is pulling its neighbors along the growth path. Okay? So what we have here is really an Asian century that primarily means economic dominance, economic strength of Asia, which is hinged on the two economic powerhouses of the region, which is China and India. And the strongest emerging economies are going to come from Asia. Okay? So let's look at these concepts one by one. These conviction that the strongest emerging economies are going to come from this region, and that China and India is going to go on becoming stronger and stronger is primarily based and fed and fueled by the experience of the golden years of 2003, 2007. And I won't have time to expand on this fully, but I'm just going to raise the point that, again, what really fed the boom is perhaps not stronger institutions, that the emerging economies know very well what to do now. Perhaps they do, perhaps they don't. But even if you factor that in, what really fed these growth rates of average 7.6% is the fact that you have that hot money flowing from the US. Okay? So the aggressive cuts in US interest rates led to a worldwide flood of easy money. Okay? So again, I would like to point out that based on this 4-year experience, it's very risky to extrapolate so far into the future. Okay? The normal business cycle is how long? The normal business cycle is 5 years. Okay? The bottom of a recession to the bottom of the next recession. Okay? And to have a clear idea about the cycle, the economic cycle of a country, what usually suffices is 2 business cycles. So you're talking about 10 years. Okay? People now are not holding stocks for a very long time. So for example, for American investors, they hold stocks on average for 4 months. Previously, it was much, much longer than that. So we're really looking at predictions that should be more prudent. It's very risky to extrapolate from the past, and especially on a very short data set and observations into so far into the future. What we also see from the golden years of 2000 to 2007, when almost all nations in the world, except for 3 countries, were growing. What we see is that what we get the impression of is that everyone can be a winner, okay, when that is not necessarily the case. For example, like I said, if you want to look at best performers meaning countries that have sustained growth rates of average 5%, we only have 2 countries, and that is Taiwan and South Korea. Okay? And when you cut back to 4 decades, to 40 years, we narrow down the field to just 6 countries. It's very rare for countries to have this kind of momentum and to sustain these very large growth rates for a very long time. Okay? So it's a very seductive notion, but we have to be very careful. Also, we have to beware of lists and macromania. What do we mean by macromania? On the basis of this list, we say that we make decisions on where to invest based on this group. Okay? Just because a country is in this group means that we invest in this country. The reason there is that you are redefining expectations. By placing these countries into a list of what's considered to be the next emerging economies, you might be changing the expectations in these countries themselves. These nations might become complacent. And they might think that money is just going to flow into their economy on the basis of membership in particular lists. So I would like to go back to reiterate that perhaps you just go back to the old rules of the game. When you pick a country where you want to invest, or when you measure the growth prospects of countries, you can't just base it on broad classifications or broad categorizations. You still just have to look at each country and treat each country as individual cases. Okay? And by looking at countries as individual cases, it means that you're looking not just at economic performance, but you can't separate economic performance from political institutions. So you also have to look at political institutions. And very basic about political institutions is the electoral cycle. So every 5 years, there might be a change in leadership, and the change of leadership is very, very important. I'll give you a very good example. I'm from the Philippines. In the 1960s, the Philippines was said to be the next big thing. Okay? So people were very gung-ho about the prospects of the Philippines. And then, of course, you know what happened. We had a dictator, okay, who was very corrupt and who was more interested in lining his pockets. And because of that, political institutions were not very inclusive. And as a result, the Philippines languished in the 1980s and in the 1990s. The biggest news for the Philippines economically was that we closed out the year 2013 by being the best performer in terms of average growth rates in the region. We even bested China. That doesn't mean anything because China is far richer, far bigger, and far richer in terms of per capita GDP than the Philippines. And what we really need to think is that, sometimes countries, because they're starting from a very poor base, poor nations, naturally, when they start growing, tend to exhibit very large growth rates. It's not because of extraordinary circumstances. It's just that by catching up, by borrowing and copying technology, they just manage to grow faster. But this growth is going to taper off. So we have to look at individual nations. I'm saying here the Philippines, of course, now Philippines is again a hot country. People are saying, okay, investment grade, you go to the Philippines. Colombia is also one, and Peru is also another very hot country now. But again, look at the experience of the Philippines. It can be good for 10 years or so, but then you have to look carefully. In the Philippines, what seems to make the Philippines smell very nice right now is that the current president is the son of Corazon Aquino. And by rising to the presidency without any reputation for corruption, seems like he's a very admirable, honorable president. But you can't really hang your hat on the president. In the Philippines, you still have to go down to local governance, and you still have to look at the towns and the provinces. You just can't look at Manila. You have to look at, it's a very large country. You have it with very large, very influential local governments, where the local elections can be very, very violent. And so there's going to be misappropriation in the provinces when power changes hands. And that is something that you have to be very, very sensitive to. And you have to keep your ear on the ground too. That's why, especially now when you see bestseller books, right? You see where the next emerging economies, or what's great for that. If you're not in Asia, you read up these books and you form your idea. But it's very different when you come into the region and you see how things really are. When you travel to Indonesia, or when you travel to Vietnam, or when you travel to China, or when you travel to India, then you get a very different picture of how things really are. So what I would say is that the other perspective is that really what's going to be dominant economically is not just really Asia, but just China. Okay? And there is reason to believe that China is not going to keep chugging along at 8%, 7% growth per year. China has very big challenges. And I'm just going to focus on two because these are the most recent ones. So China has been accumulating a lot of debt. Okay? If you exclude the shadow banking, the debt as a share of the GDP is 130%. But if you include shadow banking, then that's already more than 200%. And people are saying, well, it's not going to blow over, and perhaps it won't. Okay? Again, I'm not telling you what to think. Okay? So the thing, though, is that, well, we just have to keep an eye on China, because what's happening is that there's, just because a country has very large foreign exchange reserves doesn't inoculate it or doesn't protect it from a credit collapse. Okay? So that is one problem that we have for China. Also, another thing is that China is now a middle-income country. In fact, in the classification, it's now an upper middle-income country. And what happens empirically is that when we observe at the economic performance of countries, what usually happens is that when they reach this income level, it becomes necessary for the country to have some certain structural transformation. That means that countries cannot rely on low wages to regain the momentum, and to further the momentum of growth. And we see that already for China, and it's been some years now. In 2010, wages have been rising steadily in China, and this has been taken to be an indication that the surplus pool of rural labor is dried up. And it can no longer, the country can no longer rely on that migration of cheap labor to keep wages down. So wages are now rising in China, and now China is not the cheapest place to produce manufactured goods, right? People are even saying that perhaps it's a lot cheaper to produce goods in Cambodia and in Indonesia. So China needs to reform its institutions. It has to think about becoming more inclusive. And the jury is still out. We don't really know how far China is going to undertake this kind of reform. So the middle income trap, I'm lifting this again from the video from ADB about the Asia 2050. So it says, okay, if countries continue to grow at these present levels and they are able to maneuver around the middle income trap, then this is what their share is going to be. Like I said, 52% of the world GDP by the middle of the century. But if they are unable to avoid the middle income trap or to get out of the middle income trap, then it's going to be substantially smaller. Okay. So then when I'm going to finish with this, that when we look at the growth prospects of countries, I think it's best to look at cases individually and to consider all possible cases, and not just to think about economic performance, but also think about institutions. In the end, it's all about institutions. I don't know if perhaps you're very familiar about the book Why Nations Fail by Darren Acemoglu. And there he's an economist, but he deals a lot with institutions. And what he's saying there is that nations rise or fall on the basis of institutions. Okay? You can have perhaps very fast growth initially when regimes are authoritarian. But eventually, if you want to grow more and grow for a longer period of time and to punch above your weight, you have to become more inclusive. So you have to have more inclusive institutions, not just about elections, but to encourage more entrepreneurship and to encourage more innovation in the country. Okay? So there's no magic formula. In the Goldilocks years of 2003, 2007, that's not going to happen again. It's when the US cuts back and does quantitative easing, we will see that more and more. The growth rates are just going to come down to a new normal. We can't expect countries to be growing at that rate anymore of 10%, 12% for a very long period of time. So that's it. I'm now open to questions.
How do you see the geopolitical tensions going forward with China versus Japan, for instance? You've got the sinking of the South Korean Navy ship a few years ago. You've got Cambodia and Thailand fighting across the border intermittently. How do you see that affecting, or A, developing, and B, affecting the growth of the region going forward as well?
The economies might grow on their own, right? But in terms of cooperation, this is of course obviously a very big stumbling block. And not just because there's a lesser incentive to trust each other, but there's a greater incentive to go back to the US as an ally, to form bilateral ties with other more advanced countries outside of the region, rather than becoming stronger as a group here. So I think this is very poor form. I don't know. There has to be a more diplomatic way of going about things.
And do you think that geopolitical tensions will increase as China becomes a stronger power in the region?
Okay, so if they're going to have a problem economically, that's bad in the sense that it's a very big nation in the region. So as a very big player in the supply chain, it's going to have a very strong ripple effect towards the region. So if something is going to hit China hard, it's going to affect the region very substantially. But also in the sense that they will have to contend with these domestic issues, they will have to contend about the economy, they have to think about these issues, then they will have so much on their plate that perhaps they might not prioritize these political or these territorial ambitions. It can also go the other way. They can also, because of these tensions at home or because of these economic problems, and that might also push them into becoming more aggressive. I'm hoping for the first one. And hope for the first.
The success of the region is also relative to other areas of the world. So how much of your analysis is just based on, let's say, the challenges or the performance of the area? How much of it is also maybe due to a rebound in the US economy, fueled by the shale gas or other such things?
So what we saw, like in my explanation about the hot money flowing in, you have such now an integrated economy that you cannot really dichotomize. You know, that you're growing because your institutions are very strong, but you also have to think about multifaceted explanations to the phenomenon. So I'm saying that, well, on one hand, it always pays to strengthen your institutions as a, you know, with what you have, even though in the rest of the world it's going to be very bad, but domestically you can weather through it much better than you would if your institutions are weaker. But the danger also there is that if, as a whole, the global economy is very good, for whatever reason, then your performance as an emerging economy, you can't really separate what's due to your own efforts as compared to what's just fueled by outside factors. Okay? And that's going to become increasingly the case as countries become more and more integrated. So I hope that I did not give that impression that it was just this or that. It's really I was hoping for a more balanced and a more comprehensive approach to it. And also the idea that, that it's the same thing, the same issue with credit. It's like you're saying credit is always bad. It's not necessarily true, right? What you want is for credit to go into productive investments. And what makes credit very harmful is when you take more and more dollars to just maintain the same level of growth. And that's when you know that money is going to unproductive investments. So you have one thing which may be good or which may be bad. So you have to, it has to be more nuanced. The analysis has to be more nuanced and more comprehensive. Any questions?
Might have a last one. You might have absolutely no opinion on that, but just a couple of observers are saying that, purely speculatively, right? That crisis in Ukraine might push Russia to actually establish a closer relationship with China. And Russia has a lot of energy, China has a lot of, well, actually technology and the complementarity. And what do you think? Is there a possibility that it will actually strengthen the Chinese economy and have a positive impact on growth in Asia, while somehow weakening the position of Europe, who probably will have to pay the energy from Russia at an even higher price when it will have to go back to ask, to possibly beg for Russia to deliver the energy that.
I think now what Europe is doing, if I'm not mistaken, is to shift gears and ask for energy from the US, you know, because the US is now new sources of natural gas and so on. So I think that's one buffer that they're thinking of. And in fact, with the G8, they want to kick out Russia, and there's stuff about that, which of course BRICS doesn't really want. But I think, you know, whether that's going to strengthen China or not, it also is going to boil down on institutions and how they resolve their debt problem. Because they can keep borrowing and borrowing, but if it's not really going to contribute to growth, then these efforts are going to. China, what I perceive with China is that their credibility rests on having very good economic performance. And so if they don't have that, if they don't clean up their house, then no matter who their allies are or where they get energy from, it's the same problem all over again, and it's just going to improve. So they have to address this problem.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.